Good evening and welcome. I'm Keelan Burke, Director of Fellowships and Academic Programs here at the Newberry. Thank you all for joining us for this evening's program. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collections in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and online digital resources. The Newberry reading rooms and exhibition galleries are open to readers at no charge and with no appointment necessary, Tuesday through Saturday. I'd like to also mention that our exhibition galleries will be open until 7:30 this evening, so if you'd like, please plan to visit them after the program. The two current exhibitions are Pop-Up Books Through the Ages, for which you can also get your very own takeaway Build a Newberry. They're wonderful and fantastic. We have some here, but there are also some in the galleries. And the second exhibition called Wheels in the Hanson Gallery. At the conclusion of tonight's event, we will convene a Q&A. Please text your questions for the speakers to 833-899-3399 at any time during the conversation this evening. These are the exhibitions. This is the number to call. They've got it all planned out, but I didn't press the buttons like I should have. Apologies. Programs like this one are free and open to the public, thanks to the generosity of our community of donors. Please consider making a gift to the Newberry online at newberry.org. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers for our program. Christina Gerhardt in conversation with Indira Khera. Christina Gerhardt is Associate Professor and founder of the Environmental Humanities Initiative at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, former Barron Professor in Environment and the Humanities at the High Meadows Environment Institute at Princeton University from 2021 to 2022, and a permanent senior fellow at the University of California at Berkeley, where she taught previously. She is also an environmental journalist. Her writing has been published under the name Tina Gerhardt in The Guardian, Grist, The Nation, The Progressive, and Sierra Magazine, among other venues. Christina was also here last summer doing research in the Newberry's collection with a fellowship supported by the Newberry Library. Indira Khera is a Metro reporter at WBEZ. She's at the station on a year-long Pointer Cope Media and Journalism Fellowship. Her reporting focuses primarily on science, climate, and environment. Indy started at WBEZ as an audio news intern. Prior to BEZ, she worked with NPR's science podcast, Shortwave, which is fantastic. If you haven't listened to it, it is an excellent podcast. Indy graduated from the University of Chicago with a degree in biology.
Sister of ice and snow, I'm coming to you from the land of my ancestors, from atolls, sunken volcanoes, undersea descent of sleeping giants.
Sister of ocean and sand, I welcome you to the land of my ancestors, to the land where they sacrificed their lives to make mine possible, to the land of survivors.
I'm coming to you from the land my ancestors chose. Island Kainan, Marshall Islands, a country more sea than land.
I welcome you to Garashlitnunat, Greenland, the biggest island on earth.
With me I bring these shells that I picked from the shores of Bikini Atoll and Brunette Dome.
In my hand I hold these rocks, picked from the shores of Nuuk, the foundation of the land I call my home.
With these shells I bring with me a story of long ago. Two sisters frozen in time on the island of Buyay. One magically turned to stone, the other who chose that life to be rooted by her sister's side. To this day, the two sisters can be seen by the edge of the reef, a lesson in permanence.
With these rocks I bring a story told countless times, a story about Sesuma Amna, mother of the sea, who lives in a cave at the bottom of the ocean. This is a story about the guardian of the sea. She sees the greed in our hearts, the disrespect in our eyes. Every whale, every stream, every iceberg are her children. When we disrespect them, She gives us what we deserve, a lesson in respect. Do we deserve the melting ice, the hungry polar bears coming to our islands, or the colossal icebergs hitting these waters with rage? From one island to another,
I ask for solutions. From one island to another,
I ask for your problems.
let me show you the tide, coming for us faster than we'd like to admit. Let me show you airports underwater, bulldozed reefs, blasted sands, and plans to build new atolls, forcing land from an ancient rising sea, forcing us to imagine turning ourselves to stone.
Can you see our glaciers grown with the weight of the world's heat? I wait for you, here on the land of my ancestors, heart heavy with a continuous thirst for solutions. As I watch this land change while the world remains silent.
Sister of ice and snow, I come to you now, in grief.
Mourning landscapes that are always forced to change. First, through wars inflicted on us.
Then through nuclear waste dumped in our waters.
On our ice.
And now,
This. Sister of ocean and sand, I offer you these rocks, the foundation of my home. May the same unshakable foundation connect us, make us stronger than these colonizing monsters that still to this day devour our lives. The very same beasts that now decide who should live,
who should die? Sister of ice and snow, I offer you these shells and the story of the two sisters as testament, as declaration that despite what we are told, we will not leave. We will choose stone. We will choose to be rooted to this reef forever. From these islands,
we ask for solutions.
From these islands,
we ask, we demand that the world see beyond
ACs, SUVs, their pre-packaged convenience, their oil-slick dreams.
Beyond the belief that tomorrow will never happen, that this is merely an inconvenient truth.
Let me bring my home to yours.
Let's watch as Miami, New York, Shanghai, Amsterdam, London, Rio de Janeiro, and Osaka try to breathe underwater. You think you have decades before your home falls beneath tides?
We have years, we have months before you sacrifice us again, before you watch from your TV screens and computer screens to see if we will still be breathing while you do nothing.
My sister, I offer you these rocks as a reminder that our lives matter more than their power. That life in all form demands the same respect we all give to money.
That these issues will affect each and every one of us. None of us is immune.
And that each and every one of us has to decide if we will rise.
When we're wrapping our heads around climate change, like you said, it can be easy to just lean right on the science and focus on the science, but the impacts of climate change, are so deeply pervasive and will change so much more than just what we can establish with our understanding of science. But I'm curious about, I think in the intro of the book, you did a really phenomenal job of breaking down what exactly sea level rise is and what its impacts are. So I would love to have you just walk us through those concepts.
Sure, yeah. So the impacts, to come to the science part of the book, and it really is interdisciplinary. There's flora and fauna that appear. I got really fixated on animals for different islands, unique animals that appear in different islands. I was influenced there by this beautiful book by Amy Nezuko-Mata-Thiel called World of Wonders, which I highly recommend if you're interested in animals to check out. Came out, I think, like a year ago. The other book for thinking animals in this, in Sea Change, that was really influential for my thinking is a book called Undrowned by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Black Feminist Materialist Lessons from Marine Mammals. And that gets more into the oceanic, which is very near and dear to my heart. But to come back to the question that you were asking about the science that's in the book and some of the specific impacts of sea level rise on islands, I talk about two different kinds of islands. I talk about high islands or volcanic islands. I talk about low-lying islands or atolls. High islands or volcanic islands, both my editor at the University of California Press and my cartographer Molly Roy were like, should we include them? Because they're not the shrieking headlines, by which I mean they're not going to be underwater by the end of the century. And I said we absolutely need to include them for the following reason. When you have a high island or a volcanic island, you can think of the big island in Hawaii here. A lot of people tend to cluster around the coastline for a couple of reasons. The island might still have an active volcano, so they don't want to be anywhere near that tip or cone. And high islands often have densely forested steep inclines leading to that cone. That's not uniformly true. Puerto Rico is a high island, but it's not nearly as high, and there's not really any active volcanoes there. But so with the population density around the coastline and people clustering there, what you have is that high population density that puts people at risk, and then all the things that people like to bring with them, which is infrastructure, that big category, which means what? Things like highways, airports, wastewater treatment facilities, power plants, right? So if you think of where airports are located here, right by the waterfront, at least for the older one, Midway. If you think of Boston, New York, the Bay Area, similar in terms of where airports are located. So high islands are going to be impacted by sea level rise because of that kind of clustering. Low-lying islands or atolls are going to be impacted because, say, the Marshall Islands, which you saw in this video that we opened with, they are often, the Marshall Islands specifically is like 6.5 feet above sea level rise. The UN scientific body, which is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC for short, it predicts 1 foot of sea level rise by 2050 and 3 feet of sea level rise by 2100. Now, those are really conservative estimates because the IPCC works by consensus decision making. So if you take the National Climate Assessment Report, which is produced every 4 years in the US, the most recent one was put out in 2018, they predict 6 to 8 feet of sea level rise by 2100. And for the first launch event that I did for Sea Change, I was in conversation with Christina Hill, who's a professor at UC Berkeley and a contributor to the IPCC, and she said immediately as I was going through these 1 foot by 2050, 3 feet by 2100 figures, she said immediately, her brow was furrowing as she was seated next to me. And when I got to the higher figure, she's like, that's what I would say, given my experience, even though she contributed to the IPCC. So we're at 6 to 8 feet, and the Marshall Islands are 6.5 feet above sea level rise on average. So they're going to be really impacted. To come back to your question, Indira, about the specific impacts on low-lying islands, I would name two, one of which is the salinization of soil. So when you have all that salt water come in, it upsets the balance, the structure, the pH balance of soil. If you have too much salt water in soil, plants can't take up that water. And a lot of the islands in Sea Change, not all of them, the Kingdom of Bahrain and Singapore would be exceptions here, have really small economies. You can measure that by GDP, you can measure that by average annual salary. And that means that people are subsistence farmer and fisher folk. So if you have that salinity coming in and contaminating the soil and making these plants making them really challenged to take up that water, that's going to really impede or prevent people's abilities to feed themselves. So that's one impact as it gets into the soil. The other impact is a lot of low-lying atolls. I mean, you saw, right, the Marshall Islands. It's just a few yards wide. The main island is a mile around. There's no rivers running through low-lying atolls, right? So the way that they get fresh water is through rainwater catchment, literally catching the rain that falls from the sky and setting up structures to do that. And the other way that they get fresh water is through freshwater aquifers. So when you have sea level rise coming in, it inundates the freshwater aquifers. And then again, you have a problem with having enough fresh water for humans, for any animals on that island, whether that's livestock, pets, free-ranging, roaming animals. And then the plants, again, can't take up that water, right? So those are some of the specific impacts.
And that sort of brings me right to my next question, which is about how much of the book centers relationships and culture while we're considering climate change. And there's on page 79, if I could just have you read that section, because I think you write it really well.
Where I'm talking about currently, we are in what scientists have called.
Yes, it's the section where you mentioned Elizabeth Colbert.
Yeah, currently we are in what scientists have called the sixth great extinction. This is referencing Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Great Extinction. Not only is a scientific phenomenon, extinction is also influenced by and in turn impacts histories, cultures, and values. And extinction cannot be understood outside of the current economic system.
So why to you is it so important to be thinking about relationships and culture as we're talking about climate change?
Right. I think in terms of extinction narratives specifically, I spent a lot of time in putting this book together thinking about extinction narratives with regard to Indigenous peoples and with regard to Black people in the following ways. There's a problematic tendency to have extinction narratives, which some of you may be aware of, either here in person or online, with regard to Indigenous people because it relegates them to the past. And so Gerald Visner's concept of survivance was really influential in my thinking there, which is specifically the notion of continuing to live on to the present and to having a livable future. The concept of a livable future is something that I took from Christina Sharp, specifically her book In the Wake, where she does this in her book Ordinary Notes, which was just recently published. She talks about the trauma of the past, which I think for both population groups, and one can think about other population groups that have experienced periods of trauma. I'm thinking specifically of the Holocaust here. All these events are totally different, and their differences should be acknowledged. But if a population has experienced trauma, I think it's really important, and I try to do this in Sea Change, to once acknowledge that moment of trauma, that period of trauma, and the kinds of things that it unleashes. This can also be historical, political events. It can also be personal, individual, private kind of traumas that are experienced. And then to figure out how to live a life, how to move forward. And Christina Sharp really focuses on that. This is something that Catherine McKittrick in her book Dear Science also talks about. And the culture is really important here. So Christina Sharp in her most recent book, Ordinary Notes, celebrates art, celebrates daily acts of beauty, of taking note. She often tells people to look up, look at the sky, look at the world around you, appreciate art, appreciate poetry. And that's another reason for the interdisciplinary approach that I'm taking here. I'm also going with an interdisciplinary approach, to come back to the previous question for 1 second, because I think it's important to recognize that Western civ, that basically that putting disciplines in silos, I'm in academia, as Keelan mentioned at the introduction at the beginning. I'm in academia, and I think the siloing of disciplines into different colleges and into different departments, the College of Social Sciences, of Natural Sciences, of Arts and Humanities, that is a Western civ construct, for better and for worse. That is not, in terms of what I've learned living for the past decade and teaching in Hawaii, that is definitely not how an indigenous cosmology works. And again, the work of Catherine McKittrick, Christina Sharp, so many other Black feminist materialist thinkers whose work I engage, also pulls down these kinds of disciplinary boundaries and leads to this interdisciplinary approach.
Another part of the book that I was really struck by was how you talk about factors like militarization on islands and housing, and how those things also put these places pretty uniquely at risk for climate change and sea level rise. Can you talk a little bit about those social factors that also put these places at risk?
Yeah, definitely. So the two main economic motors or engines, and I'm using those verbs, nouns intentionally. The two main economic motors or engines for islands are often the tourism industry and then for many of them, the military. I have a chunky paragraph in the introduction that outlines how many islands the U.S. military uses for its bases around the world. Kept thinking about taking that out because I thought it was common knowledge. Talked to a bunch of friends, realized it wasn't common knowledge, put the paragraph back in. I was also thinking of taking it out because, as any good writer or editor will tell you, a paragraph that's just a list is not a good paragraph because it's like, I see some people laughing and smiling. It's not where's the argument? And so the impacts, to come back to your question, the impacts of having a high level of the military industrial complex or tourism industry connected to each island are the following. I mentioned the subsistence farmer and fisher folk, right? I'll take Hawaii as an example here. A third of Hawaii's land has been given over to the military. I'd estimate about a quarter to a third of Hawaii's land has been given over to the tourism industry. Both of those industries run up housing costs, so you were asking specifically about housing. Both of those industries run up housing costs. The tourism industry does it in a way that, the houses aren't always occupied. So some of these are, condos, timeshares, where people aren't always in them. The other impact that it has is it takes away the land that you could actually be using in order to have a sustainable economy or a sovereign economy in terms of food. So if you have 2/3 of the island being used, then you can't use that for farming. And so as a result of that, in Hawaii, we ship in 95% of our food. So and these figures are similar for Puerto Rico or other islands that are occupied in some capacity by the U.S. or by other previously colonizing entities. The islands I have 49 islands, as I mentioned in my book, and they are not all nation states. Some of them are still colonized. Some of them are parts of commonwealths. Some of them, like Guahan in the Western Pacific, are unincorporated territories. I explained what that means and how confusing that term is. But I think it's really important to be aware of the tethering of islands to either current present-day imperial occupiers like the U.S. or former colonial entities that are still in some capacity connecting the islands to them, tethering them. The military is one way of doing that. The oil industry is another. So we ship in about 95% of our oil in Hawaii to do what with it? Not for cars or vehicles, but in order to power our air conditioning and to generate electricity. We're located in the middle of the Pacific. We could go solar, we could use wind. It would be so easy. Islands are so ideal for decentralized wind and solar. You don't need the kinds of things we're talking about right now in the US, right? The transmission lines to get this transition to go. We don't need those on islands. I mean, not to the extent that we need them here on a continent. And so we ship in a roughly the same amount, 94, 95%, of our electricity is derived from these fossil fuels. Again, figures are similar for Puerto Rico. And then what happens when you're in the Caribbean, and like Puerto Rico is at the western end of Hurricane Alley, you put yourself at risk of those shipments of food and of oil being interrupted anytime a hurricane comes through. And we saw that, of course, with Maria, right?
And another big way that you tell stories in the book is through maps, these really beautiful and accessible maps. Can you tell me a little bit about the mapping process? And I understand there's a bit of a connection to Newberry as well.
Yeah, thanks for asking questions about the maps. There's a huge connection here to the Newberry. I worked on these maps. I did the research for the scientific data. I fed them to cartographer Molly Roy, who created all of the maps that you see in Sea Change. She did a terrific job. We did not focus on the same elements for every single map, so I asked her for one map to focus on power plants, which I mentioned previously, for another to focus on agriculture, for another to focus on freshwater aquifers. The research that I did for sea change last summer, which Kil mentioned in her introduction. I was a short-term fellow here at the Newberry last year in June of 2022 and was just so thrilled to have the month here to work in the archives. And I was my breath was just taken away. I saw so many maps here in real life, as one says, in 3D in some cases that I'll mention, that I had only ever seen on a computer screen in some image. And it was just amazing to be able to see these maps. Some of them I hadn't been able to see because they're not available online. So I just want to mention a couple of them here. During my time in residence at the Newberry Library on a short-term fellowship last year, I conducted archival research in the cartography collection, specifically two collections. The Ayer collection and its materials focused on voyages, travels, and early accounts of the Americas, and its materials focused specifically on Hawaii and the Pacific. The other collection I looked at were the holdings of maps and sources devoted to travel and exploration. Specifically, I tapped Bourdon's early Isolario, which translates into Book of Islands, is what it's often referred to as, from 1543, the collection's other island books, and latter-day tourist materials, such as maps, guidebooks, and travel brochures. It was just remarkable to see archival maps in person, as I mentioned, that I'd only ever seen online. So this is specifically, and this is a map that appears after the entry for Greenland. There's a wooden map, they're called Amasalik wooden maps that document the coastline of eastern Greenland. This is a map that's been carved by Inuit, and it documents the eastern coastline. And a lot of, the atlases are colonial genres, right? They're one of the most colonial genres. They dovetail with voyaging. And so there's some really classical hallmarks of that genre that I'm following here. The blue of the atlas, the yellow of the atlas and its cover, those are classic hallmarks of the atlas genre. There are other ways in which I try to detour, and if you want to go with situationist terminology, and if that means nothing and your eyes are glazing over, I try to turn upside down or decolonize the atlas. And what I mean there is I'm getting into other forms of mapping. When voyagers first arrived in the Pacific, they were stunned by oceanic navigators because they weren't using the magnetic compasses that people were using in Europe. They were voyaging by many other methods. If you're interested in reading more about this, I would recommend David Lewis's book, We the Navigators. So the kinds of things that they were using to navigate is also another thing that I saw here in the archives. The Marshall Islands, to return to that example, their navigators specifically were using stick charts. These are really incredible maps, if you will, that show swells. Swells are longer and deeper than waves. And as a navigator in the Marshall Islands and in Oceania, another way of referring to the Pacific, you are trained to feel these swells by being physically put onto and in the ocean waters and to feel them. Eventually, when you're on a boat, you learn to feel these swells as you're navigating, because they weren't using maps, the kinds of maps, if you're thinking about walking down the street, Google Maps type thing. You were feeling the swells, and the reason that that's important is they refract or move around islands as you're approaching them. So if you're really attuned to feeling swells, when there's an island up ahead of you, you may not be able to see it because it's that far away, but you can feel its impact on the ocean waves that are coming at you. Another thing that they were really attuned to reading was birds. There are certain kinds of birds that travel 100 or 200 miles or whatever, pick your number, from islands. And if you start to see those birds, even again, if you can't see the island, you know you're approaching the island. I'll mention the third example is the furry eyebrows example. Imagine eyebrows that are pointed up, kind of like a mountain peak. And if you see those on the horizon, below that little peak is typically an island. So again, even if you can't see the island, if you can really read the clouds, you can guesstimate that an island is going to be up ahead of you. So that was another example of something that I was just amazed to see here at the Newberry. I'll just give a couple of other examples because it was just such a delight to be here. I had the chance to see the 1928 reproduction of the Tabula Rogerania, which is an atlas that was commissioned in 1138 by the Norman king Roger II and completed in 1154 by the Arab geographer Mohammed al-Idrisi. I also got to see a reconstruction of the 1507 Waldseemüller map, which is the first map to depict the Western Hemisphere, what indigenous people would call Turtle Island, and what is called by the inhabitants of North America, who were settler colonizers, which is typically called America. And it's the first map to use the name America on it, obviously coming from Amerigo, the navigator. So these are the kinds of things that it was a delight to see. This map by the Arab navigator and also cartographer was important for me to see because when I talk about the Kingdom of Bahrain, I also talk about the history of Arab navigation as well as of Arab cartography, which has a really long and deep tradition. I also talk about the history of Chinese navigation and Chinese cartography, because I think it's important to get out of that Western-only focused mindset with regard to cartography and geography.
Yeah, I hope we'll touch on Bahrain in the next few questions, actually, because I definitely am curious. With this next question, I'm thinking about what you said about extinction narratives and trying to counter extinction narratives. And I think one way through the book, obviously, despite the severity and the frustration of the situation of climate change and sea level rise, you also make an effort to talk a lot about solutions and how places are innovating and thinking about making sure that they are able to weather the storm. So can you tell me about how islands across the globe are thinking through solutions to this?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's really important to focus on solutions for a number of reasons. As Keel mentioned in her introduction, I taught at Princeton's High Meadows Environmental Institute for a year and a half, specifically environmental humanities courses, and I'm establishing an environmental humanities initiative at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I noticed that my students were really despondent for a number of reasons. There's a whole cluster of issues that are unfortunately impacting young people. There is obviously the climate crisis, there's an economic crisis, there's student debt, which we didn't get a decision about, but we'll hear about that at some point in terms of what happens with that debt. There are future job prospects. I'm not going to keep going on. In terms of the environmental humanities and the climate crisis, I thought as a result of that, and this wasn't my first awakening when I taught there a couple years ago, I thought it was really important to offer solutions to the climate crisis in every single class. Because I think just focusing on the problems, the crisis, isn't a good way to address the climate crisis, to resolve it, right? And so every single entry into the book, Sea Change, similarly has solutions included in it. As an environmental journalist, there's also a wing of environmental journalism that is solutions-oriented. And this isn't just for the environment, that's solutions-oriented. So I'll just mention Yes Magazine, which was founded based in Seattle, Washington, as a journal that is specifically focused on solutions. With regard to sea change and the solutions to sea level rise, and with regard to islands that I talk about, I have two broad categories. So hard engineering is one. There are seawalls. This would include things like seawalls that are being erected around the world. So there's a thing called the Big U around the southern tip of Manhattan, which is an island, I'll just remind. And it's being erected around the southern tip of Manhattan around Wall Street, which, tells you what's important to protect there, because it's not being erected around the entire island, and that's where they're starting, and that's what they're prioritizing. There are also seawalls that have been constructed off of the coast of the Netherlands. Venice has seawalls. Is there any construction here in Chicago this summer? Freeways? Anything downtown? Anyone experience anything?
A lot of highway construction.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing some laughs and some smirks and some nods of recognition. Okay. Any of those?
The potholes are bad.
Yeah.
The highways, the roads, yeah.
I'll be
Yeah.
I'll be careful if I'm biking or walking. So yeah, those projects, do they ever run over time? Do they ever run over budget? Yeah, okay, a lot, okay. So with the seawalls, they're prohibitively expensive. They typically run over time. They typically run over budget. So remember when I said that a lot of the islands in the book have really small economies? Hard engineering is not something that they're going to be able to afford often. Seawalls is one example of hard engineering. I also talk about raising islands with an S, not a Z, which means lifting up islands. So the foremost at-risk islands globally are the Marshall Islands, Kiribati and Tuvalu in the Pacific, and then the Maldives in the Indian Ocean. Of these four islands, the island of the Maldives in the Indian Ocean has already constructed an entirely new island. I include a map of that new island in the book. So there's 3 different panels that I had Molly Roy, the cartographer, create. The first one is 1998, no island exists. The next one is 2008, and they've started building this new island from scratch. And the next one is 2018, and lo and behold, there's an entirely new island. My colleague at UH, Manoa, Chip Fletcher, who's an oceanographer and advises on a lot of these projects, traveled to the Maldives and showed me a video of him just driving around as this island was in construction. He's also been to the Marshall Islands and told me that the negotiations there, and I've heard this from Kathy Jetnil-Kieshner, who was in the poem at the very beginning. And as I mentioned, she's not only a poet, she's also a climate envoy. So again, showing these disciplinary boundaries are not really options for people who are living on some of these islands. She has talked about the fact that they are thinking of constructing an entire island in the center of their atolls. So atolls are volcanic islands that have sunk. So they're often ring-shaped. If you think about the ring of the tip of a volcanic island, or think of a coffee cup or something like that. So that's the shape typically of atolls. And what they're so they're oceanic or watery in the middle, and that's where they fish. And so they're talking about constructing entire islands in the middle. Again, the low economies that I talked about. Right, so this is something that will be very difficult for these islands to afford. The last thing that, in terms of hard engineering, is infill or land reclamation. I talk about Singapore and sea change and infill. I don't like the word land reclamation because it makes it sound like you're reclaiming land from the ocean, and that's not really what's going on. Infill is a much more accurate description of what's going on. You're filling in the ocean in order to expand the footprint of an island. Again, the finances, as to whether or not islands can afford that. Singapore and Bahrain are doing this. They're both in the book, and they both have really high economies, so they can afford to do that. So the other solution then, what can islands afford to do? The other solution then would be soft engineering. And this is also referred to as nature-based solutions, and these are the kinds of things that islanders can afford to do and therefore are often doing, because there's not a lot of action from the global north, which is historically responsible for creating the climate crisis. Islands, on average, have produced a negligible amount of CO2 emissions, something on the order of 1%. Again, that varies because some have high, intense emissions economies, but most of them are very low emissions. So nature-based solutions include things like protecting and restoring coral and oyster reefs. They're kind of a buffer if you're looking at the ocean. They'll buffer wave action, which naturally erodes a coastline. If you turn around 180 and look back to the land, they'll also filter the water. After a rainy day like today, the water runs across, here in Chicago, the roads, everything people have poured down drains that they shouldn't have, all those chemicals going into the water. And if you're living in a more of a rural environment, when the water when it rains, when it goes across the land, everything from the agricultural industry, so that could be pesticides, the dung from any of, the livestock, all of that going into the water. I don't want to pretend that reefs are a magic seawall against sea level rise in that direction, or that they can filter everything, but they do important work. Wetlands are also really important buffers, right? That's another nature-based solution. We've destroyed a lot of wetlands. If you walk along, the waterfront here or in other areas, we've taken a lot of coral reefs, oyster reefs, wetlands away from coastlines because why? Well, if we're flying to an island in the middle of winter to get away from the cold in Chicago, we want to walk along a beach and then into the water. We don't want our feet cut up by the reefs that are right there, right? So we've removed this also to create harbors, right? We've dredged, we've fortified the coastline, we've put skyscrapers up along the coastline, Lakeshore Drive, highways, these kinds of things. That means any kind of water coming in doesn't have anywhere to go. And there used to be places for that water to go, right? And the mangrove forest is the last thing I'll mention here in terms of nature-based solutions. I call them trees that walk on stilts because their roots stick up out of the ground by feet often. Mangroves are really unique. Remember how I was saying that when the soil gets too salinized, the plants can't take up the water? So mangroves are unique in that they can live in really salty environments. And they live along coastlines in the tropical zones, and they too provide that kind of buffer. What's important about coral and oyster reefs as well as mangroves, well, and wetlands too, is aside from thinking about them as from an engineering perspective, as I've been laying out, they're all really crucial environments, like, marine habitats or environments unto themselves. Right, and I think that makes them all really important. So when the Supreme Court handed down the decision a couple of weeks ago that that it was going to impact wetlands and not protect them, I was just gutted because I've been doing radio interviews like 2 or 3 a day for the last 6 weeks for Sea Change, and I've been talking about the importance of wetlands. And here we have this decision; they've already been destroyed, and so here we have a decision that really doesn't help protect them.
And so we've talked about solutions coming from islands, but I'm curious, and we'll have to get to questions in a few minutes, but what are some things that regulatory bodies and governments and things like the UN that they should be keeping in mind when they're thinking about how to support islands across the world while they're grappling with sea level rise?
Right. So I think one of the things when I'm talking about sea change in a fairly landlocked, I say fairly because I'm looking in the direction past the windows, I'm looking towards Lake Michigan, so fairly. And I recognize, that the Great Lakes is a body of water that itself will be experiencing sea level rise. It's another issue. When I'm talking about this book in the U.S., I think it's so very important for each of us to recognize the incredible amount of power that we do have, even if we feel powerless. The U.S. is historically the world's largest emitter of emissions. The burning of fossil fuels leads to those emissions. Those emissions are what are responsible for sea level rise, right? So any action we take here, regardless of what your comfort zone is, whether that's restoring wetlands, getting involved, locally, protesting lowercase d, doing uppercase D work, in a democracy, getting engaged with politics or politicians, any of this has an impact. I always say action is better than inaction on this front. I think everyone can just follow whatever their comfort zone suggests for them in terms of taking action. China is the world's largest emitter present day, but a lot of people say that China's emissions in part should be on the ledger of the US because the goods that are produced in China, and that creates emissions when things are produced, are consumed by people in the US. And that means they have to be shipped here, which is more emissions, and both of those emissions could be put on our ledger. I'm not going to weigh in on that issue. It's food for thought. But I do think that we have a lot more power than we would like to think here. We certainly have a lot more power than people in the Marshall Islands. The kinds of things that can be done at the UN level is to acknowledge the fact that nations in the global north are historically and present day the largest emitters, and to hold them responsible for that. In the U.S., we could also recognize that the fossil fuel industry. I mean, there's been ways of calculating the way that California sometimes characterizes the fourth largest economy if it were a nation. You may have heard that figure. In terms of emissions, the U.S. military would be the fourth or the fifth largest emitter of fossil fuels if it were counted as a nation. We don't hear a lot about the Navy's emissions, right? One of the reasons their emissions are so high is that spread around the globe that I've been talking about, but that's just one of the many reasons. So if we reined those emissions in, that could be really helpful as a solution. But basically, every time we hear about fossil fuels, we should think emissions. When we hear emissions, we should think the air temperature globally is rising. Whenever we hear about the air temperature globally is rising, we should think about what I mentioned earlier, which is thermal expansion. The ocean temperature is rising. The oceans have absorbed 90% of emissions. They can't absorb anymore. The closet is stuffed. Spring cleaning has not taken place. Okay, that's not really good news. And when we hear about ocean temperatures increasing, we should think sea level rise. And then hopefully, my hope is that we'll think about some of the islands that are in sea change, right? So take that whole chain back where I started with fossil fuels. That's the reason why reining them in is so very important with regard to sea level rise in islands, right? Any action there is going to be helpful.
And then my last question for you is just, what is your hope for what readers of this book, like you all, can take away from the book itself?
I think the reason to cycle full circle to your first question, or the second one after the poem, but it connects to the whole the reason for including the poem and the poems. I hope that the book Sea Change sparks curiosity about, interest in the situation of islands, their history, their culture, places that we may be familiar with. We may have diasporic populations here in the audience, people who by heritage are from these islands, have traveled, have visited them. And even if you've never been, really to think about the way that we are all connected and to think about these islands and their present day situation. Also to think about the solutions to the climate crisis. And there are things we can do right here to help this situation. I want to thank you for being in conversation with me.
Of course,
and I
thank
want to
you so
thank you all
much.
for attending in person or online. And I'm excited about the discussion, the conversation.
Yeah. Well, perfect. We're going to take some questions that have been texted in. Let's see. Okay, so first question. This person was wondering whether you know what the economy of islands like the Maldives are based on in addition to just fishing and industry. Is it tourism?
Yeah. The Maldives is the tourism industry is really important for the economy of the Maldives. I don't know if any of you have seen, leafing through the Chicago Tribune, you might see resorts and high-end vacations. And the Maldives is typically featured in these. They're really high-end resorts, and that's a huge part of their economy.
This is a really interesting question, actually. Someone asked, what was the earliest evidence you found of ocean rise in your research, or where, someone identified that the ocean was rising?
That's a terrific question. In this era particularly, I think it's really important to stick with truth. And part of that is admitting when you don't have the answer to a question that might not be on solid ground. I think it's interesting for a number of reasons. There's a book by Patrick Nunn, N-U-N-N. He is a white writer, scientist, scholar of the Pacific. And he wrote a book where he was reading indigenous tales from thousands of years ago. This gets into oral versus written documentation. So they were passed down, and he tracked that there was in these oral histories that had been passed down, generations to generations before they were written down, that there was a discussion of sea level rise in them. I haven't read this book. I don't know the veracity of these claims, but I would recommend this person maybe consider checking that out.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. What can individuals do to affect climate policy to try and prevent the worsening of these problems on island communities?
Endless array of options. And get involved in politics yourself, by which I literally mean run for office, especially if you're a younger person. Getting involved in politics, running for offices, writing to political figures. There's, a couple of key people I can think of but won't name in DC who seem to be beholden to the fossil fuel industry. Why do we consider this person a Democrat still? I have no idea. Writing to your representatives, right? Any of these, let them know that change is needed. There are politicians who are so beholden to the fossil fuel industry, it's unbelievable, or maybe it's entirely believable. I mean, the UN is taking place in the United Arab Emirates next year on the heels of having taken place in another fossil fuel state. So, why are we surprised? But speak up about these things, right? It's only through speaking up that change actually happens, which is where I'd like to encourage people to be Democrats with a lowercase d, by which, I mean things like protests. And that can take all manner of forms as well. It's only because of the protests of having had 400 members of the fossil fuel industry attend last year's United Nations climate negotiations, which somebody said was kind of like having, the tobacco industry at a cancer convention, that things change this year and they're actually going to rein in and take action to make sure that there aren't as many fossil fuel representatives at the UN. Speaking up, taking action. There's a whole range of options.
This next question I'm actually really excited about as someone who's interested in climate health and health equity. Could you comment on the healthcare implications and diseases that might be appearing in islands as sea levels rise?
Yeah, I'm grateful for that question for a number of reasons. I mean, this book is really a project of environmental justice, which is racial justice, social justice, and healthcare is a huge component of that. Living close to places that are impacted by sea level rise has a number of effects. So I did talk to both my editor and also to the cartographer about this. The book is not only about islands being underwater, which would be a dramatic headline, but it's also it's not really about a line approaching you from the coastline. It's really about zones of inundation. And what I mean by that is that your home becomes increasingly uninhabitable because if you've looked at images after Hurricane Katrina, or if that's too far away in the past because you were hardly around to witness that, we can think of more recently Hurricane Sandy or the remnants of Ida, which struck New York, New Jersey. Zones of inundation where you see pictures of homes that are moldy and mildewy. We have to remember that many of the islands, not all, but many of the islands in my book are in tropical areas, which are prone to really high levels of humidity. So they're prone more to mold and mildew. That's a direct health impact. We can think of the houses, just being inundated and just uninhabitable because of that. So even if they're not underwater, that could have a direct health impact. And then in one chapter, and I didn't know if this impact would really make sense to people who are reading it, but I kept it. They're closing schools earlier because the kids don't have enough to eat. So they can't concentrate, they can't think. And we know a lot, we've heard a lot about food insecurity. If you think about the importance of anything from the breakfast programs that the Black Panthers put forward in the 60s that were so inspirational for a lot of other demographics. The importance of feeding kids breakfast, lunch programs in schools right now and why they're really intensely debated. Food is a basic right, and it's really important for being able to pay attention and for young kids, right? Not just for their growth, but just for their education too. And that really struck me. And then I would refer people to thinking back to subsistence, as I was mentioning earlier, right? Just the fragile economies and being able to feed oneself on some of these islands.
And then our last question is bringing it back to the Newberry. Someone wants to know what the most striking or interesting discovery you made was while you were looking through the collection of the library.
I think one of the many things I immediately loved, starting with the orientation that all the fellows did last summer, and this was intensified as I was working my way through the archives, is and to some extent, part of this was new to me. I'd done some research online before coming here, before applying to get the grant. The focus on Indigenous studies of the collections and on the Indigenous peoples of the Midwest. In the archives, but also in terms of the fellows who are here. So I really appreciated the conversations that I had with members from different area tribes and the kinds of things that they shared with me that they were doing in terms of archival research here, and how it connected both with their educational background and also with their educational backgrounds via their tribes. So the formal, and then also the university, but also the ones they were getting from their tribes. Yeah.
Well, I think we are just about out of time. That's all the time for questions that we have. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was great.
Yeah, thank you for being in conversation. Thanks to the Newberry for making this event possible.